this effort that led to the NWSA endorsement of the call to boycott issued by Palestinian civil society in 2005. So closest to my left is Dr. Rosenwasser, former president of NWSA and someone who helped ensure that that petition was not merely something that we signed at NWSA. Next to Barbara is Dr. Gina Dan, who went with us in Puerto Rico into the community where we were connecting those struggles and continued to lend her support to this work both at NWSA and elsewhere. Next to Gina is Dr. Rosenwasser, who worked with us on this statement that I'm going to talk about, but also who supported Nabab and my work on those issues in elsewhere. To Roger's left, we have Penny Rosenwasser, who has written and organized on Palestine in various places, including in NWSA, in Palestine, and in a Jewish Voice for Peace. Okay, we have people coming in. I lost my trying to get I met Sherry Guevara doing this work when she was at Rutgers and then in Women in Black in New York City. Sherry Guevara too was instrumental to our work and has actually preceded this recent effort that was launched 5 years ago in her tireless work within the Jewish caucus and in other spaces at NWSA and elsewhere to make sure that injustice and violence in Palestine and our responsibility as feminist scholars is taken seriously, and that we continue to find ways to educate and agitate about it. And last but not least, my sister comrade, Dr. Rabab Abdelhadi, that has worked with me and with others and has become a model, not just on what we do, but also how we do what we do, especially that work in the face of attacks and backlash. With that, I would like to go to an excerpt from that call that we wrote, and to say that when you launch a campaign, you don't know what will happen, but that we really thought of every word carefully and intentionally. And so Feminists for Justice in For Palestine emerged as an ad hoc for Palestine support an indivisible sense of justice. As feminist scholars, activists, teachers, and public intellectuals, we recognize the interconnectedness of systems of oppression in the spirit of intersectional perspective. We cannot overlook the injustice and violence, including sexual and gender-based violence, perpetrated against Palestinians and other Arabs in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and is colonial displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians during the 1948 Nakba. The discriminatory treatment, exclusion, military siege, and apartheid imposed by Israel on its own Palestinian citizens, as well as those residing in the occupied territories, constitute flagrant breaches of international law, UN resolutions, and fundamental human rights. In the present moment, our counterparts in Palestine face daily violations of the human rights, including the academic rights to free speech, assembly, association, and movement. At the same time, Israeli institutions of higher learning have no challenge, but instead legitimize Israel's oppressed policies and violations. These violations, which severely impact the daily lives and working conditions of Palestinian scholars, students, and the society at large, are also enabled by US tax dollars and the tacit support of Western powers, thus making any taxpayer in the West complicit. Say who are committed to justice, dignity, equality, and peace. We affirm our position to the historical and current injustices in Palestine that we view as part and parcel of the multiple oppressions we study and teach about. We also affirm NWSA's commitment to the principles of human rights, justice, and freedom for all, including academic freedom. So with that, I'm going to turn this to Vice Kuczewski, who will in a discussion.
Well, mine will be briefer because I don't have to read what you just read, which I was going to do. So that's wonderful. I'm an activist in Jewish Voice for Peace, New York City and nationally. And I'm also active, have been in Feminists for Justice in and for Palestine. I've been to Palestine twice in the last 2 years. I come from a demonstration on Montgomery Street today in strong opposition to another genocidal, vicious attack on Gaza. So this is my heart, and I'm so happy to be here. I want to pick up on the theme of yesterday's session. There are two historic trends in NWSA. It's turned to becoming an organization led by women of color with an explicit commitment to anti-racist, abolitionist, feminist scholarship and activism, and its development of a dynamic interest group, us, Feminists for Justice in and for Palestine, that succeeded in securing an organizational resolution in support of BDS. Those are monumental. But these two trends are not only coincide historically, but more important, they have reinforced one another. They are bound together. As Tricia said yesterday, it was a very international term for NWSA. Now, this was a collective effort, and I want to just acknowledge a few people who also need to be recognized in this effort, whose names need to be listed here. And I think particularly of the conference in Milwaukee in 2015, where we did this year. And I want to just mention Brooke Lorimer, whose incredible artistic and messaging work was embodied in everything that we did. I want to mention my colleague in JVP, Tali Ben-Daniel, a Mizrahi feminist who's the facilitator of JVP's National Academic Advisory Council, and the picture I will embed it in my mind of Tali, so selfless, sitting on the floor, cutting out these little badges that said, I support BDS. Hundreds of them, sitting there for hours doing that. The badges that Brooke had designed. These small and large creative actions make a movement. And I want to acknowledge also Jasbir Pubar from Rutgers University, who was the keynote speaker in a plenary and who used that occasion to stand up and support our effort and to support the BDS resolution, insisting that it be passed. And Jasbir, of course, is another target, a very hideous. Well, let me now also pick up on what Angela said yesterday, and I think it's really important. NWSA went beyond other associations, did something more radical, not just supporting an academic and cultural boycott of Israel, but endorsing BDS. But I want to pose a question, and we'll come back to it. What does this mean in practice? What lies beyond a resolution, and even beyond perhaps BDS? A new hybrid formation. The syncretization of scholarship and activism and the critical life and death around the critical life and death issues of our world under the leadership of women of color. In a time of proliferating fascism, misogyny, white supremacy, including white nationalist anti-Semitism, we should not underestimate how important and potentially revolutionary, but also dangerous this is. Now, I was going to read from our resolution, but Simon already did, but I wanted to particularly point out the piece that says, these violations, which severely impact the daily lives and working conditions of Palestinian scholars, students, and society are also enabled by U.S. tax dollars and the tacit support of Western powers, thus making any taxpayer in the West complicit in perpetuating these injustices. So I want to look at sanctions. What does that mean? What role could NWSA play here? That's hard. But there are new directions of activism necessary and possible. When feminist scholars and activists engage in researching and protesting militarism, policing, police exchanges, something we're very involved in JVP, the exchanges of surveillance technology and so on, can make NWSA a dynamic site of resistance to all of this hideous, it's fascist. And it's international, it's global, and our government participates, our police departments participate, our CIA, and then divestment. I'd like to see more sessions at future conferences that would focus on the explosive coalition-building potential of campus-based divestment campaigns against fossil fuel industries, against the vulture banks, against the evil hedge funds that are raping and pillaging Puerto Rico under the benign named Financial Control Board, and of course the companies and organizations that support Israeli apartheid and genocide. Many of these are the same. Many of us, we can work together on our campuses, and that kind of work can be the focus of important sessions at NWSA. So am I at the end of my first session? Okay. Thank you.
Who wants to go next? Because the vice, no one wanted to go, vice volunteered to go first, now, yeah. Go, someone go.
I'll go.
And I'm Penny Rosenwasser. Thanks so much, Simona and Rabab. Very honored to be with this group here. I was actually chair of the Jewish caucus at NWSA a bunch of years ago, and also I'm a founding board member of Jewish Voice for Peace. And I teach a class at City College of San Francisco with a Palestinian colleague, anti-Semitism, anti-Arabism. And I'm also on staff at the Middle East Children's Alliance, and I've led, I think, 4 women's peace delegations to Palestine and Israel. And my last book actually did talk about support for BDS. It's called Hope into Practice, Jewish Women Choosing Justice Despite Our Fears. So I first came to, and actually I also want to say, I'll get to that in a minute. I first came to NWSA in 1996. I was not in Puerto Rico, much to my regret. But I was so moved by the Roundtable yesterday, the incredible rock star panel, a Roundtable, and I learned a lot about things that happened there that I hadn't known before. And I also wanted to bring into the room, any of you who were at the plenary applied, boycott is one of the most powerful forms of activism. So I noted that, and I wanted to bring that into the room today. I'm just going to briefly sketch a few examples of Palestinian solidarity activism work that we did at NWSA preceding BDS that I hope helped contribute to building support, and also make the point that for many, many years there has been strong support for Palestinian activism here at NWSA from the membership. And so I'm going to give a few examples of those. Always working to support the leadership of Rabab, of Layla Farah, of Barbara Ransby, of Simona Sharoni, of Beverly Guy Sheftal, and a few others. One of the most significant actions was in 2001, when we organized to get the NWSA General Assembly to pass a resolution against the Israeli occupation. And this was actually initiated by the NWSA president at the time, Bernice Carroll. And it was submitted by members of the Jewish caucus and other supporters attending from that resolution. Therefore, be it resolved that the National Women's Studies Association urges its members and the general public to support all nonviolent efforts to end the military occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. So that was 2001. In 2002 in Las Vegas, I showed my slideshow, Women Waging Peace in Israel-Palestine, and the room was packed. And a lot of what I did was focus on the faces and voices of Palestinian women activists. I had soundtrack from interviews I had done there. And it also highlighted Jewish Israeli women activists against the occupation. Yesterday, Angela Davis talked about the report back in 2011 of the Women of Color and Indigenous delegation to Palestine that Rabab led. That was to a packed room. I was there. It was really powerful. And that same year, Sherry and I initiated and spoke on a panel, my esteemed colleague Sherry Gorelick, who you will hear from soon. And our panel was War on Gaza, the Hidden Crises for Women. In 2013, Sherry and I organized a roundtable. Arab, Jewish, and feminists of color discussed BDS as a nonviolent strategy, and included Rabab, Leila Farah, Isis Nusser, Lee and Sherry, and my esteemed colleague, Sanjukta Mukherjee was the moderator of that panel. We really wanted Jews and allies to become active and speak out about BDS and not to be held back by fear of being called anti-Semitic or self-hating Jews. And then finally in 2015, where we were in Milwaukee, Sherry and I dreamed up this roundtable and actually got it approved as the official panel for the Jewish caucus. And it was called 2 Jews, 3 Opinions, a critical query of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against the Israeli occupation. And of course, Sherry and I were on that, and it was moderated by our Jewish caucus chair at the time, Robin Epstein. And we really created it because we wanted to have a critical dialogue among and between Jews about these issues. The panel was, of course, before the vote happened. That happened after the conference was over. So I'll just end by saying 2 things. One, to piggyback on I think what Roz was also talking about, that after the resolution passed, in an interview that Rabab did, I think maybe it was with Chronicle of Higher Education, I can't remember, but the NWSA was the first major academic organization encompassing feminist, gender, sexuality, and women's studies to back BDS. And I think that's something we can all feel really, really proud of. I'm really proud of that. And finally, that I really loved at our 2017 opening plenary in Baltimore, when President Barbara Ransby asked Angela Davis what most excited her politically. Part of Angela's answer was, Palestine is now part of the progressive agenda. So thank you.
I guess so. How's everybody doing? Good. So I want to thank the organizers of the panel and the work that this group of women do all day, every year for this conference. And this is a fairly informal exchange. We don't have a key question to address, and this doesn't come out of my scholarship. It comes out of my activism, which is related but not direct. So I'll just share some thoughts that are on my mind in terms of the title of this panel, 5 years since the assault on Gaza, 5 years since Puerto Rico. And we don't have our sister Vanessa with us. Is that, yeah? So I'll say a word about that. Rabab sometimes, and it has a real resonance. And I think, for me, the question of Palestine is an important question on so many levels, that it is the issue around which many progressives and leftists are silenced and shut down and intimidated. And Palestine is important on its own terms, but it's also important as a kind of symbol of the silencing that can go on, and it is going on around other issues. And I see that of us around Palestine is kind of a canary in the coal mine, if you will. And so seeing it in that context is important. But sometimes, this notion of the indivisibility of justice, people can argue it's too messy, it's too large, it's too unwieldy to talk about multiple struggles and multiple issues at the same time. It's too unwieldy and messy to talk about a large matrix of systems of oppression. But as intersectional feminists, as myself as a challenge, and this is our charge, So when our delegation went to Palestine, Indigenous Women of Color delegation in 2011, that idea got hatched at an NWSA conference, and then a small delegation of us went. I think I took with me not only an interest and a commitment in Palestine, but the traumas and the tragedies of white supremacy and the racism in this country. And so even this week, you know, when we see the bombings in Gaza, the family in Gaza, you know, I think also about Tatiana Jefferson in Fort Worth, Texas, who was shot by police in her home. And almost 800 police murders have happened this year alone in the United States. So we have to begin to talk about these struggles together. We have to find a way to insert anti-Black racism and an indictment of it into our conversations and discussions about Palestine, because we didn't go there as, I didn't go there as an American. I went there as a Black, you know. I heard about the Palestinian political prisoners there, thinking about the ravages of gentrification, police violence, deprivation in many of our communities in this country when I went there and saw the open prison, you know, that is occupied Palestine. So again, this notion of indivisibility of justice, I think, is a powerful one and has to undergird our solidarity work wherever we do it. The conference in Puerto Rico was a really pivotal conference for NWSA. We went there when Oscar Lopez Rivera was still in prison, and he has since been released. Some of us in the Movement for Black Lives did a webinar recently on Puerto Rico, and the protests that are still going on in Puerto Rico is a great source of inspiration, but particularly relevant to us as feminists. The Feminista Colectiva Construcción have been at the very center of those protests. Our webinar brought Oscar Lopez Rivera on the same call with some of the young feminists in Feminista Colectiva Construcción as a way to both bridge a generational gap, but also to insert you know, sort of a gender justice agenda into that work. So again, we have to make space, and we have to have a kind of capacious political imagination that we weave these stories together. You know, my own introduction to Palestine as an issue came through my involvement in the South Africa Solidarity movement. Comrades in the ANC were comrades of people in Palestine. That was an extension of the struggle for self-determination being fought in South Africa. In fact, Omar Barghouti, who has been one of the leaders of the BDS movement, was at Columbia at the same time that I was at Columbia doing divestment work, and he often refers to that experience as inspiring his own BDS work, which is very important. So I think I'll stop there. I mean, I put all those issues on the table for us to think of the connection to each other and to remind us of the demand in this time, which is a time ripe with potential, but it's also a very dangerous time that we live in. So if we cannot stretch ourselves and have a political imagination and a strategy that weaves together or quilts together or stitches together all these different patches of struggle, then I'm really afraid for what lays ahead. So as a challenge to those of us who might be inclined to forget about Palestine, that has to be, you know, interjected into our work, into our language, into our lists of concerns, of demands, you know, in our work, and to people focused on Palestine, you know, struggling about the issues in this country, you know, the prison industry still growing, the rampant racism and white supremacy, and to name also anti-Black racism, which is also plaguing our movement, is a part of that challenge. So I'll stop there.
I first came to NWSA in 1983, which is before some of you were born. And 1983 was 1982 was the year that Israel invaded Lebanon, and Israel supported the Lebanese opera in Shatila. And since then, I've been interviewing Jewish feminists about their relationship to what we used to call the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Through the years, there have been presentations at NWSA on the issue of Palestine. And as Penny mentioned several of them, in 1990, there was a session called Peace in the Middle East as a Feminist Issue. And there have been several others. So there is a history, a grounding in NWSA for the work that was being done in Puerto Rico for the BDS. A lot of what we have done within NWSA has, of course, been influenced by what has been going on outside of it. And among those things has been the Israeli and Palestinian women's movement for peace and justice. So that in 1993, the Palestinian women's organizations, in coordination with the Israeli women's organizations, created an international conference for Israeli-Palestinian peace. It's a longer story than I can tell you, but there was a conference in Geneva, Switzerland, of 73 women from 13 consensus statements of 3 single-spaced pages. I was there, I was sent there by the Jewish Agenda and the International Jewish Peace Union. One of the things that did not get into this was boycott. But an Israeli woman who was born in South Africa stood up and said, we should initiate a boycott. The conference said, no, don't boycott, because it will increase the Israeli sense of a siege mentality and it will push Israel to the right. That was in 1991. It was 14 years before the BDS movement started. And Israel has galloped to the right, despite the fact that there was no boycott movement in 1991. In Women in Black, we hand out flyers about the events that are happening and the issues. We emphasize that our role here in the United States is to change U.S. policy with respect to Israel and Palestine. From time to time, we have put out flyers about nonviolent resistance, because people come by and say, where is the Palestinian Gandhi? Where is the Palestinian Martin Luther King? And what we have demonstrated to them is that most of them are in Israeli jails. And we had flyers that talking about Palestinian leaders who had put out information and then were sent to jail for it. BDS is a non-violent movement. And it is also a predictor for world support, because with the fact that non-violent resistance is punished by Israel, They need the support of the world. The keynote speaker at that international conference was, from Ireland. Bernadette
Devlin.
And she said that the world created the Israeli-Palestinian situation, and it is the responsibility of the world to fix it. And this movement, support for this movement from the world, is part of the way that it is our responsibility and people from around the world to support
Give myself the time sign right now.
Yeah, take it back.
Hi everyone. So there's so much to say, and I'm going to try to be brief and have a bit of a different focus. I guess I've been thinking a lot at this conference about what we have achieved, and I think these two trends, right, of having women of color take the leadership and at the same time of working toward BDS. And I think those things are such important achievements, and I want us to enjoy them, and then I want to think a little bit about how we can push further now based on that, and some of what I'm seeing. I was a member with Rabab and Barbara and probably some other people in this room and others to Palestine in 2011. And one of the reasons, there were many reasons I wanted to go, but partly to reveal that the way people perceive me as a black woman from the United States, and many, queer, whatever categories people put me in, they never put a relationship to Palestine into how they understood me. And I've been thinking a lot about this problem of identity at NWSA that we're, I think, introduce myself, and I did this the first morning we were in Nablus, by saying that not only was my stepfather for 20 years Palestinian, but also that I went to Columbia to study with Edward Said. He was the reason that I went there. And I actually didn't end up working with him in the same way that I originally intended. And it's not because he wasn't incredibly supportive. I took many courses with him, and he was very transformative in my life, and a loving presence, I'll say, in every kind of way, for you to come with research and challenge. And he was, I'll just say, to put it mildly, not a feminist. So I don't raise his name, as much as I loved him, I don't raise his name to say, Edward Said was right about everything. I raise it to say that he modeled for me the kind of generous integrity that I seek in my own life now, and a relationship to any person of color in the hallway, and just put his hand on me and say, how are you today? Look right in your eyes, just to make sure that you were okay. And it was those kinds of things that I really learned from him. I also learned that he had multiple lives. He had the university life that people knew. He had his publications in Arabic, which many of us could not read. He was doing a lot of political work, some of which he would talk to us about, and some of which he did not talk very much about. So I realized that being that kind of was key to his modeling a relationship to struggle. So I think about that, and I'll tell you a story of the one experience I had in Palestine, which was when we were at Untitled University, and we were in the presence of both some incredible women freedom fighters who had all served time in prison, and we were introducing ourselves, and I asked for people to stand who had either been inside prison or had a relationship to someone who'd been inside. And of course, we're in Palestine, so pretty much everyone in the room stood up. And I then talked about the fact that we have such a stigma around incarceration in the United States, and that sometimes the notion of a political prisoner is used to distinguish between those who deserve incarceration and those who do not. And in the Palestinian context, it was very easy for people to see prison as political. But the question that I followed with was, what will happen when you are free? What will be the role of the prison? And the reason that I wanted to have that discussion, the reason I enjoyed having those discussions there, is that I learned from Saeed and others in my life that my role is not only to be in solidarity and only to sort of have someone else tell me their stories, but to think carefully through the things that I've learned and come to understand, to create relationships that allow us both to grow and together. NWSA. I want to note the generosity that Palestinian scholars in particular have had. I think of Noura Erekat talking about Asim on Thursday night and talking about his relationship to Black community and how that changed his life and made him take certain stands. I think about Rabab telling the story from that same meeting in Anaja of singing "We Shall Overcome" and recognizing that though in our context it might mean one thing, there it meant something else. It was that all the Palestinians that I met there have toward our struggles and the way in which they know about them, are literate in them, and are respectful of them. So I am hoping that we can reciprocate and be more knowledgeable about questions that are not necessarily resolved, beyond wanting a free Palestine, really helping to work to think about freedom. And I'm just gonna end prisoners and other kinds of prisoners that I want to trouble, and the other is a relationship between nonviolence and violence. We had several conversations while in Palestine about this specious distinction and the danger of that distinction. Among the conversations, I would say one that stands out for me is with a member of Adamir Prisoner Support. And that organization, which I still try to involve myself with, but the discussion was really about how that label of nonviolence and our clinging to that label does a disservice to the struggle. So I'd love for NWSA to be thinking carefully about those kinds of categories. And a final thing I'll mention is the role of things like Canary Mission. Probably a lot of us in this room have been targeted by Canary Mission or some other, in many other ways. We mentioned Rabab, Justin Nawar, and many who are under the role of NWSA could be in defense and in robustly helping to remove the terrorist label from those of us who are in the struggle for freedom. Thank you.
Hi. So I did speak yesterday at one of our first, and as you know, and so I'm not going to. I will just make a few comments. I will also say some things in response to some of the stuff that's been said. One is I think there is not enough space here on the table to have everybody who's been involved. Right. There is a lot of people who've been involved. And secondly, actually people who, I mean, we intended it to be actually since Puerto Rico. So we wanted next year to be since Milwaukee. So, both in order for us to be able to have more sessions and justify why we have more sessions, a pragmatic thing, but also in order for us to be able to have this space to think about histories and narratives, because there are multiple narratives. There isn't one way to remember what's going on. But also, how can we include? I mean, this is an academic conference. It is an academic conference. No matter how much we want to reinvent ourselves as an activist space, it is first and foremost an academic conference with an academic format. People especially since the generation we're talking about of the Browning of NWSA have tried to subvert that. But you could do so much, given the state of the academia, given the possible, and what we can do at a particular space and when we go forward. So it's, my questions are about how is it that we can actually involve everybody who has been involved in this process and be able to speak and bring out, there's multiple narratives. How can we speak about them? Because I'm sitting here and I hear what Penny is saying, right? And what Sherry is saying, and I've heard this before, but it's not that I haven't heard it. And it gives me a very kind of different reaction. When I hear National Organization for Women tell the history of women's in the US, they always begin with the Seneca Fall Convention. They always talk Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They go through all of it, and then they say in the 60s, women went to work. It's all a white, middle class, hetero women, Anglo women's narrative. And then you always get up, and I was at NYU at one point, faculty fellow, postdoc, and there was the National Organization of Women speaking, and Frances White, who was the dean of the Gallatin School, was responding. And she also discussed, what about Ida B. Wells? What about the discussion around racism? What about the fact that indigenous and black women have always worked on their backs and in the field? What about all of this stuff? And the woman who was speaking, I think it was Kim Gandhi, she spoke and then she said, yes, I'm aware of all of this stuff. So then the question comes up and says, how come it was never integrated in the first place? And every single time you give the narrative, it's the same old narrative. And I'm thinking about that because when you think a narrative, and when I think about NWSA, I don't think about all the stuff that you have done. I actually think about the ways in which NWSA, when I argue about the Browning, I argue about a particular moment, and you both speak about this. And then when I think about the role of Jewish women, who now have become anti-Zionist, but at the time not everybody was. New Jewish Agenda definitely was very Zionist. IJPU was so-so, International Jewish Peace, because I've worked with all these groups, okay? And it is, I think, for us, kind of Israeli massacre in Lebanon in 1982 that I'm very happy now to be interviewing for oral history narratives and so on. But it's not the same kind of history. And why is it that we have in our minds different kind of narratives? And I think part of it is that, at least for me, is that when I think about who's at the center of that particular history, where is it at NWSA? It became a point where actually Palestinians could speak for themselves without that speaking out being mediated. And my history with the women's movement, with the women's studies and so on, we always had to be mediated. We had to have, if it wasn't for our Jewish sisters, Jewish sister comrades who actually did all this work for us, in a lot of the spaces we could not actually enter. We were not allowed entry. We were not, this had, and I think this is part of the narrating and narratives of what we think about how does it work. It has to do with the history of women's studies and so on. It's a very, very different moment from us when we think about the history, to think about how all these histories come together in a way that are both critical, in order for us to push our knowledge and critical, but at the same time loving and compassionate and build a kind of solidarity that actually acknowledges that things do move, that people, I mean, I used to work with a lot of people in the 80s, and a lot of people used to interrogate me all the time. And I had to go to different dialogue sessions where people would discuss the Nakba. I mean, again and again and again. And the Union of Palestinian Women's Associations agreed to participate in those dialogue sessions because there was another group of Palestinian women who were involved with Letty Cotting Programme and people in the American Jewish Committee and American Jewish Congress and so on. And they used to discuss nicely the menstruation their daughters had and so on. We thought this was useless for us because that's not what we really need. We need to discuss politics. And so we went and participated. And those women we participated with refused the mere act of solidarity of buying a mammography machine for Ramallah Hospital. And we proposed a mammography machine for Ramallah Hospital specifically because Ramallah was run by a Christian Palestinian doctor. It was in Ramallah. It was a mammography machine that was related to breast cancer. It had nothing to do with throwing stones. It hadn't even remotely have to do with anything like that. And they refused. They refused. There was a different kind, and we then ended the dialogue. We said, this is it. We're not going to come every single time to therapy sessions to talk about all of this stuff so our Zionist friends would feel good about sitting in the same space and touch a Palestinian. Sorry, we're not going to be the therapy culture. That's it. We stopped. And that's a very different history from what you were involved in. It's a very different history from Jews against the Israeli massacre in Lebanon. It's very different history from the women who started with New Jewish Agenda and have come a long way and have opened up spaces. And I don't want to, and Tricia knows, I always say, I don't want to have touchy-feely, and Tricia says to me, why you don't want touchy-feely? and of course, the love and the compassion is really amazing. And what I mean is that I really don't want to only focus on individual experiences. I want us to talk about collectively how to move forward. And so a lot of the times, those of us, at least, I know Palestinians can go through this process, a lot of the times we do have to swallow things, and we have to accept things because for the sake of the movement, right? This is not what's happening here. What's happening here is a very different kind of narratives that is going on, that I want to be able to think about how can I actually access what you're telling me, and the fact that you've had my actually struggled again and again and again, sharing almost every single week or whenever I'm in New York, there is the Union Square, women in black, sitting there and we're talking against the occupation. I mean, really. Penny, every single time we have something here, you come and the people have been involved throughout. And this is one aspect. The other aspect of it is how do we account for the involvement of Jewishness in Palestine solidarity without becoming the center of analysis? Because it's really about the Palestinians. I mean, the occupation, the Nakba, it's about the Palestinians. So this is a solidarity. How can it be solidarity in general? And how can it also be strategically about Jewishness being actually deployed as a strategic location, a privilege that actually gets deployed in order to advance the struggle. The last point I want to say, which is very interesting to me, is that in this conference 3 times I heard that Palestine is normalized. At the Kashmir panel, where these people were saying, how can we, and I was, and then Palestine solidarity. And then today, when we were at the panel around Taiwan, Hong Kong, people were saying about Palestine, I'm kind of like, this must be a different space. Maybe we need to go out to the street, or maybe I need to go across to my office at San Francisco State University, just to be reminded that this is a very different, but it also tells us that there are different moments for different things. And I think really being able to account for not only the temporality, but also the diversities in experiences in work around Palestine, for Palestine, not only to talk about boycott, divestment, and sanctions, but I really want us to start having more conversations that have been going on, but they're really at the margin. They're still at the margin. About how do we talk about is pinkwashing, for example, without actually continuing to continue the narrative that Israel actually is a queer-friendly space, but the only problem is the Israeli occupation. When Israel is not a queer-friendly space, if you're saying that the United States is not a queer-friendly space, this is the same. This is settler colonialism that also Palestine gets exceptional. And how do we have the language to be able to talk about it? So we are actually practicing in our scholarship, as well as in our activism, the visibility of justice in a way that we actually talk about it in a very critical way and push each other to kind of like not exceptionalize Palestine, that it's the only occupation, it's the last occupation, as some of the Palestinian leaders continue saying again and again. We know it's not true. How do we actually push that? And at the same time push the question of solidarity and the question of actually really critical solidarity.
I'm going to add 2 points of analysis that I didn't say. I read a call that I'm compelled to say that echoes what was said here. One, that statement, and at least my involvement in this, was an unapologetic call to action that is a critique of identity politics and shifts or calls for radical shift from the Palestinian feminists or other feminists. So regardless of my accent and where I was born and the history of how the conflict touched my body, I felt compelled in the organizing to decenter myself and my identity as an Israeli Jewish feminist. And I think that this is my call to my Jewish colleagues on the panel. I think that when we define Palestine as a feminist issue, it's very similar to saying I'm an anti-racist feminist. It is something that comes naturally to a woman of color who has experienced racism all her life. It is a call to solidarity for those of us who experience white skin privilege to enter that way and recognize the responsibility that comes with embracing an anti-racist stance. The call to understand Palestine as a feminist issue is very similar. So when the critics come and say, what about Israel? I'm like, that's your journey, sister. You decide where you stand on the side of racism and how and when you agree to incorporate the systemic violence inflicted on Palestinians as part of your intersectional feminism. I cannot do the work for you, and I refuse to enter this solidarity movement through the door of dialogue. I've spent years doing it. It led nowhere. I think the fact that Palestine has been normalized here is because we offered a praxis of how you do solidarity. And you do it by recognizing systemic inequalities and by listening to solidarity from Palestinian civil society, which I think is very important and takes us to some of the things that Barbara and Gina said here. So the question is, what do we do? The fact that we got all this backlash and it was such a big deal sometimes puzzles me. So all we did is sign a petition and pass the resolution. You know, that's it. The ask was a small ask, and I think the challenge to us is to build on that and refuse to be dragged down and explain and justify what we did. What we did was, a small drop in this ongoing struggle against multiple oppression. And if we planted a seed that other groups struggling to work in solidarity and to transform these organizations and their communities can benefit from by joining or by having us join the struggle, I think that's important. And I also want to say that it's a privilege for us to be invited to a conversation on Kashmir, on Taiwan, or on Hong Kong. And we want to say that, we're there happily wanting to engage and do that. So it's not, Palestine is not a single issue. It's part and parcel of our commitment to struggle for different feminist community and a different world. And with that, I'm going to go back to my role as facilitator and have people, how are we going to do it? We have a mic that could be, yes. So let's take this. And can we have people say, okay, would you float it? Thank you. Okay, so let us see hands and maybe, okay, well, go ahead.
Okay, first, thank you all so much. I'm actually on a panel right after this on Kashmir, Palestine, and Black Lives Matter. My name is Charlene Carruthers. Oh, we're all together. Awesome. My question, you brought up Bernadette Delvin, and I've heard her talk about peace and their struggles around peace and the contradictions of that. I've also listened to comrades in South Africa talk about it. And so I'm curious about the lessons that you all have learned the Israeli occupation through a peace framework. Because some of that is happening in the U.S. around reconciliation, truth and reconciliation and things like that. And so what are some of the pitfalls you've seen? What are some of the challenges and some of the good stuff that has come out of pursuing peace?
Yeah, sure. Let's take a step, yes. And then people could decide which ones you want.
Hi, thank you. My name is Mickey, and I asked Professor Abdelhadi already yesterday, and I would like to ask you, would you mind if I plug a BDS campaign that's running right now that it might be of relevance to people in the room
By
here?
the way, yes.
Okay, so I've been involved as a scholar and activist working alongside Al-Qaus sexual and gender diversity in Palestinian society, Palestinian queers for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and pink watching Israel. And together with the Palestinian Academic and Cultural Boycott Israel PACB, we've been working relentlessly for the past 5 years around gay tourism to Israel in particular. And our campaign has been targeting the Tel Aviv Gay and Lesbian Film Festival. And the first couple of years we were really successful in getting filmmakers to pull out of the festival. I think our first year, 4 years ago, we got 14 filmmakers to pull out. So we basically destroyed the festival, which was a great victory. But of course, the Zionist organizers of the film festival, it's an Israeli government-sponsored film festival, have adjusted to our tactics. So it has become impossible now for filmmakers and workshop facilitators to withdraw once they have submitted their films. So what we've done now is we have developed a pledge that I unfortunately am not permitted yet to share with you here publicly, which we are asking specifically at this moment queer and trans filmmakers to sign, in which they pledge that they will not submit their films to the festival, because the call for films has just come out. And once you submit, you basically sign off on that you cannot withdraw by any means. Also, the filmmaking has changed, queer filmmaking has changed, right? Queer films have become popular, which also means that a lot of queer filmmakers also don't own the screening rights to their films anymore, or the production rights to the films anymore. So large production companies such as World of Wonders have been taking over the distribution of films, queer films in particular, which makes it also harder. So come talk to me if you're a filmmaker who wants to sign on to the pledge. Come talk to me if you know filmmakers so I can reach out to them. Come talk to me if you're an organizer in the US who wants to do work on pinkwashing and wants to run local campaigns here that can help us as a transnational coordinating team to reach out to different communities, because we can't be everywhere at once. Thank you.
What is your name? Mickey. Stella.
Well, my name is Solange, but I teach in Brazil at this time. I was a professor when I came here as a Fulbright. And yesterday I was here, and I was very glad to hear the last question that was posed to the panel about how we could move forward in terms of transnational solidarities, right? That it's very good what you have done. I was here in 2011, was very pleased to listen about the first report, and I came back yesterday, but there was no time for discussion. So I came back today because I think I have one thing to say in the name of the women from Latin America, the reemergence of fundamental far-right-wing movements that have put gender at the center of the right-wing reemergence, and its attack on activists, on social movements, and on women's and gender studies scholars. You know, so this is extremely serious. So I think this is a perfect place, because we're talking about even how we combine scholarship with activism, and we are definitely under attack. And I think that, the last speaker also talked about that. My question would be, how could we learn from what you have done in Palestine to extend transnational solidarities, which is the topic of this whole, conference, beyond Palestine? Excellent, very good what you have done, but I think there is a lot more to be done. And there are situations, for instance, I belong to the generation who was arrested, who fought against the military dictatorship and social justice, and now we cannot believe that we have Bolsonaro back, like we have Trump here, right? And we have, all dictators in the town.
Yeah, take another one.
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your remarks, and I'm really thinking about this question that Gina put forward around, my name is Chandni Desai. The question around how to move forward. I've been a long-time BDS activist, and I've built several campaigns, and it's passed, and a lot of times they're symbolic, a lot of times they are material sorts of implications or possibilities that emerge out of it. But one of the things I've been really thinking about around moving forward, or thinking about the moving forward, is this question of a collective strategy. And the reason I'm kind of posing this is on 3 fronts. One is, when I think about the targeting of academics, and this is a kind of scholar activist question, is when I see the targeting of academics, a lot of times, but there's a whole slew of a lot of academics that are not known. And a lot of them are junior, and a lot of them Palestinian and non-Palestinian in this context and elsewhere. So what is the material kind of way that NWSA or scholars that are involved in NWSA or senior scholars involved in NWSA can, really think about what are the strategies of supporting those that are under attack when these things happen on a collective level. And I really don't, like, the individual thing is one necessity, but on the other hand, there's something happening. They're sitting on, Zionists are sitting on search committees, Zionists are sitting on, reviews of journals. They're sitting on everything. And so I'm really compelled to think about, as an association, how do we think about a collective strategy that is, that also thinks about those that might not have the links or the connections or the networks, or aren't activists, but so what is that? So that's one sort of collective question on moving forward that I'm kind of curious about. The second is more around activism. It's stemming from my, the activist out of Toronto for the last 10 years. And one of the challenges we're seeing now is particularly around the way the law is being used. So in some ways there's the lawfare that Rabab, you've been really subjected to. But there's this piece around the legal mechanisms are embroiling activists in such an expensive struggle that how do we build divestment or campaigns like this when our movements don't have money? And in the context of the US, you have Palestine Legal, been trying to, Khalidi. But I'm really thinking about if there's any insight, especially for any of you that have been involved in campaign work, that, how do we fight the lawfare? Or the legal kinds of battles when there's no movement money or money to fight this. And I think this has implications for Solidarity because we've been doing a lot of work around trying to build with prison divestment and fossil fuels. And when this kind of attack comes on, we're so distracted fighting that the work of divestment is also halted. And so I'm asking a kind of academic question and an activist question with hope for some insight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can we have, people speak whatever different question? Whoever wants to, do you want to take
something and people take what was not taken and what was requested? Yes,
So, I don't know. I'm feeling some kind of way. Because I feel like the way, I made a commitment a while ago to, I speak in a lot of different contexts. Mostly I speak about the Black Freedom Movement. And I said I'm going to add, I'm going to say something about Palestine every time. So, Howard Baker, I mentioned Palestine. And just injecting it. And that's a tiny, tiny, tiny gesture of solidarity. And of course, I've gotten my little harassments too, nothing compared to what Rabab has experienced. But where I'm going with this is I feel like kind of the panel the discussion has been about Jewish women and Palestinian women. And I want to hear you all talk about how we can both link to what's happening in Latin America. I mean, Evo Morales is the coup, and the slaughter of people there, yes. But, there's slaughter of people in Chicago, so we've got to talk, we are here. So we have to talk about the struggles here, the attacks on immigrants here in cages, the attacks on Black communities here that is vicious and bloody. And if we can't talk about that, even just kind of broad-based movement, we cannot, we can't say we're talking about Palestine and then we're in solidarity with the Black struggle, and that's it. I mean, I have not heard that on this panel. I need to, when I bring young Black students to events, they've got to hear at least some analysis incorporated that we know what's happening here at the same time that we're talking. That's how we move them to see, the connections is that they hear the solidarity coming from, not just Black people. So that's some kind of way that I'm feeling. I think we undermine ourselves when we don't do that work, when we don't make that a part of the case that we make in the announcement. And we can make it. I mean, the surveillance that is going on here the IEF is training police forces here. We see echoes of the kind of occupation of black communities by police here, the treatment of brown, immigrants here. All of that has to be a part of our lexicon when we talk about Palestine, and that's how we grow the movement in solidarity with Palestine. Again, I say I came into it through the ANC, through the Free South Africa movement, and I began to understand the connections. But we do talk about it in silos, and that makes me very upset because we're not going to build the kind of movement we want to build if we continue to do that.
So Barbara changed, yes, thank you. Barbara changed what I was going to say a little bit, because I want to think about that. Yeah, I mean, we need to do that. Some of the most interesting work and academic work, I want to talk about what Bob said about the fact that we're an academic organization that I've been engaged with, has been around, I'm going to use the word dialogue, but I don't mean it the same way, South-South dialogues. And things that bypass the usual power circuits and are really about marginalized communities interacting. And I hope that NWSA will actually be focused more and more on that. I think the presentation, I can't remember her name right now, on the Dalit situation and me casting Gandhi for us and all of that, we could go on and on. But I think to pick up on what Barbara said, it also means getting a better understanding about what we mean by geographies. And so some of the Black feminist work on trying to talk about geographies is really also to say, what do we mean when we just point to the US as if we understand things as a map? And so, what are we saying when we're talking about North and South? I think that's something that this organization could do very powerfully. I do want to say that, to underscore what Rob said about our being an academic organization, he never felt it. I also was drawn to his work partly because there was work you needed to do to be able to unthink what the common sense is, and that gave academic work its meaning. And I feel that we have to defend that a bit more. I'm a little worried that we want to be popular. Some people don't know who my partner is, so you'll probably know why I'm saying this. But there's a lot of focus on kind of being the name, but doing that hard stuff, and sometimes not necessarily telling people or advertising everything you're doing is a part of being able to do that work. So I think we need to be a bit better in the organization about understanding what's really going on here. I often talk about non-reciprocity. I was just in Brazil, and where is the person who asked the question? Yes, I spent a good amount of time there, so I was just there, and I learned not to pronounce the name of your president. So just like we say, resident of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, I'm now calling them both the things. But that's just a joke. But the more serious question is, what are the forms of solidarity? So I was in Brazil, and one of the things that I've been experiencing in my years of working with Brazil and knowing Brazilian literature and other things from the time I was first in college is the racism that's also a part of those conversations. And a lot of times in the United States, we have these weird conversations about Brazil or any place that's not the US, as if we're talking about one kind of people. So again, this is where we're academics. We've got to do much better, and I think we are, but we've got to keep pushing on that because it's going to be so hard. So I think we need to refuse the non-reciprocity. We have to be deep learners about what other people are doing and experiencing. And that also means translation. Why do certain things get translated and circulated and go? Every time I'm in Brazil, they're trying to ask me to do something that some Brazilian scholars. Two more things. I know I'm talking too much, sorry. Yeah. Oh, it's up?
Of the session.
Oh my God. Okay. We're going to stay for a second. I just have to say, I don't think this, our statement was merely symbolic. I do want to say as a literature scholar that that's also work. It does work to protect other people. organizations standing on these principles are actually making things happen. I don't believe it's merely symbolic. And finally, I wanted to say that we should make our universities support us. I've been part of asking universities, and I think we can all make our universities do that.
Just a note to people who have to get to another part of the Hilton. The next session starts in about 15, in 15 minutes. So you have time. We'll continue the conversation, but if you need to leave, we're not going to take it personally. So thank you for coming. No, I mean, and some people on the panel need to leave, so let me ask you to thank everyone on the panel. And then for those of you who can and want to continue the conversation, for people that don't need to run, we could stick around here for a little bit.
Just say a little bit. First of all, I so relate to the relationship to.
I can't hear you. Mike is not on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is it on?
No.
All right. No, my mentor was Ibrahim Abulabud. And Ibrahim Abulabud was a great Palestinian scholar. So I want to reinforce what Gina was saying about the importance of thought and the importance of being academics who challenge that divide between scholarship and activism. That's what we do. We say it's a false binary. And recently I've come across some scholars who I thought were with us on that and were not, and it was very disappointing. So I want to say this is dangerous work. It will not get you to, but we have to do it because we are in crisis. Because this time requires that we do very subversive and dangerous things. I also want to interrogate a little, this is in response to Simona, the idea of solidarity, that we do solidarity in all these fabulous ways, but it's not just solidarity, and this is a little personal and emotional. But something that Rabab has often said is, Jewishness is not the same as Zionism. We all fight that idea, okay? But every time there is an attack on us as defenders and supporters in solidarity with Palestinians, it's also an attack on our Jewishness. That's not my Jewishness. So it's very personal, it's very integral, and it's about solidarity, but it's also about personal integrity. And just finally, I love what you said, our sister from Canada. These lawfare law traps are really vicious, and we have to think our way outside. We can't just, and lawsuits. And I do think that's a very, very critical thing for us as scholars and scholar activists to be focused on, is reinforcing what you said, and I don't know the answer.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say a few things. One is that I think to Charlie's question, it's going to get worse before it gets better. Everybody needs to know that it is collective effort, and it's going to be. They are very desperate. Bullies are not going to go away unless we hold them accountable. So I want to echo what Gina has said in terms of making our universities. It's their responsibility. They hired us. They have to protect us. We have to be able to use public funds in order to do things that produce knowledge for social justice. And anytime they keep challenging, so we need to push back. I mean, we really need to push back. Those of us who are more senior and so on, and I'm not, we have to stand up. And the people who are, we don't have enough lawyers. We need the legal community to step up and actually be supportive of everybody, not only of us academics who are being attacked, but of the kids who are being killed on the streets, of the gentrification that's going on, of the greed, of all the injustices. And I would say that this is the same thing for my compañera Solange about the whole, there is a right-wing move. There is the consolidation of white supremacy, Christian right-wing, greed, corporatization. It's all over the world. It's coup d'etat in Bolivia, all the attacks that are going everywhere, but people are rising. There is protest everywhere. I mean, you see from Chile to Lebanon, everywhere. I mean, there is people are in the streets fighting day in and day out. And I think it's really, really important to keep both. How nasty they are and how resolved people are to fight. And I just don't want us to leave on a note of actually this nastiness that they are, because they are very nasty. And it's their job to be nasty. They have to protect their interests. But we have, and I think it's okay for us to have all these disagreements. It's okay for us to have all these debates. We will not be able to grow unless we have these debates and be very open. And the fact that we actually can have all these debates with each other reflects the amount of love and respect, and I'm talking about community love for all our communities. The fact that we can be critical of each other. We can come together and actually build something else. But we're also standing up. We're refusing to go. The fact that we're still here, we're refusing to go away. And we're not going to go away, but things are going to get, be prepared for things to get worse. They're going to.
We do have power to do work in our classrooms on solidarity, connecting Palestine to the movement for Black Lives, to the other struggles going on in other parts of the world. There is a piece that Rabab and I co-authored in conversation with other feminists after the vote, drawing lessons from what we've done, and it came out in International Feminist Journal of Politics in 2015. But there's been some scholars on that topic, or there's curriculum that was created in workshops that Rabab co-facilitating on teaching Palestine. So there's work on the barricades and in doing petitions, but there's also quiet work in our communities and in our classroom, and there is now a practice of how we do it and how we support one another. So thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and join our group. If you're not members of Feminists for Justice in Palestine, access your profile and just click and become a member.